My dear, long-suffering Judeo-Christian friends, it takes a lot to stir this old codger to Sunday school teaching mode these days, as humanity roasts and dies by its own stupid hand in the final great extinction. Mostly I lick the wounds inflicted by 74 years of life and huddle with my cats and the music that has made life more or less tolerable all these decades. But every now and then, some bolt out of the blue rekindles that dormant impulse. So here we are with a fresh look at creationist carnival barker Kent Hovind, precipitated by a post by one of my myriad Facebook friends who will remain unidentified in this account, except for my use of the masculine pronoun when referring to him, thus narrowing down the possibilities to roughly half the human population. A few days ago, he posted this and invited me to fact-check it. I'm happy to oblige, but in order to do that, I'm going to have to address the excerpts in this video in their original context, that of a creation seminar that this con man held in a church before an admiring audience of people with narrow opinions and an eagerness to be duped. Hovind is such a profligate liar that addressing all his bullshittery is going to take some time, and you can probably expect 5 or 6 installments of this. That should keep us entertained while we watch the United States of America writhe in its death throes. As you can see, what my friend posted originated on a Flat Earthers Facebook page. And although my main thrust in this Sunday school lesson is some claims Kent Hovind made, I do have to wonder about my friend's grasp of cosmology, given his having gleaned a Hovind video from a source I wouldn't honor with the time of day, much less visit in search of useful information. Here's the Facebook page in question, and it will be my pleasure to link you to it in the description below in case you'd like to spend a little time in La La Land and see what the people are thinking. Hovind's entire presentation is about 33.5 minutes long, and although the excerpts presented in the video my friend posted come to only about 5% of that, I can't address them thoroughly without providing the context from which they were wrenched. I'll try to deal with roughly the first 5 minutes of the seminar in today's Sunday school lesson. I don't want to go longer than about half an hour because I know you need to get on with brunch. I will play Kent's video and intersperse comments as needed. Strap in tight and keep your head and arms inside the car at all times.
Carbon dating. I get asked this question all the time. Jonathan spent $70 to get this book, right? And the new one's out and it's $80 now? $80. Okay. Radioisotopes in the Age of the Earth, the RATE Project, R-A-T-E.
The full title of the book Kent was brandishing is Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth, a Young Earth Creationist Initiative. It's published by the Institute for Creation Research. The ICR is a creationist apologetics ministry founded by hydrologist Henry Morris in 1970 and is headquartered in Dallas. Henry Morris had achieved public notoriety about a decade earlier with the publication, together with John Whitcomb, of The Genesis Flood, the Biblical Record and its Scientific Implications. That was one of the pioneering tracts of a newly energized young earth creationist movement that has since proliferated maddeningly and rotted many otherwise potentially fine minds. Its early champions included Dwayne Gish, whose name has been memorialized in the dishonest debating tactic known as the Gish Gallop, and Stephen Austin, a sellout geologist with an actual degree in geology. Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis got his start at ICR. Despite their highfalutin title, ICR is not engaged in any actual research. Their scholarly activity, such as it is limited to combing through scientific publications for cherries to pick, wrenching them out of context to support their positions. That's not the way science works. It's the way apologetics works. Don't waste 80 bucks on the book or $68.75 on Amazon. I'll link you to a PDF file that includes the entire text in case you want to spend several more hours of your precious time under the sun plowing through creationist drivel.
I am sure not a world's expert on carbon dating, but I think I can explain things.
Well, he certainly is no expert on carbon dating or anything else as far as I can tell. And I'm also skeptical of his claim to be able to explain things. At this point in my review of this masterpiece, I need to make something clear. I'm no expert on carbon dating either, or on any subject outside the narrow band of the musical spectrum that I've devoted my life to. That's where my expertise lies. When it comes to the compositional techniques of Joseph Haydn, I can tell you all about those, and you can rely on what I say about them because I've spent years studying and understanding them. As a good many of my students can attest, I'm also pretty adept at explaining them in ways that can be easily understood by those with a rudimentary grasp of music theory. But when it comes to science, I really think you should learn that from scientists, not from a musician like me. And you certainly shouldn't learn your science from people who are trying to undo science like any creationist apologist or shill for the fossil fuel industry. But that doesn't mean that a pretty full grasp of at least some of the sciences lies beyond the reach of the average person. There are wonderful science communicators who can practically give you a doctoral level education in geology, geochemistry, cosmology, evolutionary biology, classical physics, atomic theory, environmental science, or anything else you want to study. I have learned much from communicators like these. I can link you to a good number of them right here on YouTube. For God's sake, don't get your science from a flat earth Facebook page or from a snake oil salesman like Kent Hovind.
I'm a teacher. I can explain it as best I can. That's what a teacher's supposed to do. Take the complex and explain it where the average person can get it. And say, since I operate about 4th grade level, I got to understand it myself first so I can explain it.
There's so much to unpack here. First, is that really the job of a teacher? Is a teacher's job as Kent described it? Or is that where his problem starts, and the problem of his deluded flock? The only reason for simplifying anything is to get your students prepared to take the next step, which is reliably in the direction of more complexity, of more information. One simplifies a concept only to get a useful grasp on it until it can be understood more completely. What Kent is describing here is almost like masticating the food you intend to feed someone else, making it unnecessary for them to do any work. Here, swallow this. By my lights, that's not teaching, except insofar as indoctrination could be considered a sort of teaching. For me, teaching is a facet of educating, which means that education involves more than mere teaching. Education aims at stirring the dormant minds to wakefulness, opening doors of inquiry, and inviting students to enter them to explore what lies beyond their current frame of reference. Education aims to kindle curiosity, not answer questions. Education aims at creating active learners. Indoctrination aims at stagnation and stultification and reliably achieves them. This next excerpt is where my friend's shared video begins, and as we hear what the good non-doctor has to say, you'll want to keep in mind the context I've provided so far. That's going to prove important.
Let me explain how carbon dating is supposed to work, and then tell you the serious problems with it. Carbon dating was not invented until 1949, in the last 60 years.
Kent is being deceptive here, which is his stock in trade. There's just enough truth in his statement that the deception might not be readily apparent. But think back to the way he began this seminar, by referring to a book published by the ICR under the title Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth. Right after announcing that title, Kent went directly to, "I'm not an expert on carbon dating." He's conflating the two. He does it all the time. Listen to his seminars or those ridiculous whackin' atheist spectacles he hosts at his cult compound on Wednesday evenings. Do you see why it was important that I furnish the context for this excerpted video? Radiocarbon dating is a subset of radiometric dating more generally, which deals with a great number of unstable elements and their decay pathways, their decay rates, and their daughter products. Uranium-lead decay was well understood by 1907 when B.B. Boltwood published his Disintegration Products of Uranium in the American Journal of Science and proposed its application in the dating of igneous rocks. The phenomenon of radioactive decay had been discovered over a decade earlier than that by Henri Becquerel and Marie Curie, and scientists had been working tirelessly ever since to understand its particulars and possible applications. So radiocarbon dating is a single installment of a journey of discovery and application that had been well underway for half a century already. So we can effectively roll back what Kent is actually whinging about by that additional half century. It might be worth remembering that the first application of radiocarbon decay measurements was on materials of known age to guarantee the accuracy of the measurements, and that it happened 4 years after 2 Japanese cities were incinerated by bombs developed by scientists who understood radioactive decay thoroughly. There's nothing arbitrary about atomic physics, and its applications in other fields are perfectly reliable, partly for reasons I'll touch on later.
So when they started telling the kids the Earth is billions of years old, back in 1830, they didn't tell them because of carbon dating. They never thought of carbon dating, never been heard of, okay? Why were they teaching the Earth is billions of years old 160 years ago?
They weren't. By the way, you hear the conflation I mentioned earlier, right? Radiocarbon dating did not have and never has had any relevance whatsoever to the age of the Earth. Kent is either lying or stupid, and those possibilities do not exclude each other. Now, Kent claimed that they, whoever they are, started telling the kids that Earth was billions of years old way back in 1830. That's a bald-faced lie. 1830 was the year of the publication of the first edition of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, the first comprehensive geological textbook ever written. Much of Lyell's work was based on that of his predecessor, James Hutton, who had noted and described geologic features that could only be explained by the passage of immense amounts of time. The Hutton-Lyell synthesis, 1830 is the year, regards the present as a key to the past and rests on the assumption, note that word, that natural processes remain in some sense uniform over time. Contrary to a popular misunderstanding, uniformitarianism does not mean that all geological features have been formed by nothing but slow, steady processes. What it does mean is that we do not invoke the miraculous to explain anything that can be explained by an appeal to or an exploration into the same kinds of natural processes still at work today. Hutton and Lyell are justly recognized for having fanned the flames of a kind of enlightenment in geology. But they did not invent geology, and they were not the first to intuit that Earth must be very old. We live on a dynamic planet, but its dynamism is largely expressed on timescales much vaster than a single human lifetime or even all of human history. That insight lay behind the pioneering work of Nicholas Steno, who laid the foundations of crystallography and stratigraphy in a 1669 publication. In the same article, Steno proposed that fossils are the lithified remains of ancient life, a revolutionary idea at the time. By the way, Steno was a devout Christian and was late in life elevated to the bishopric. His understanding of the earth was not an impediment to his faith. My point is that even in the 17th century, young earth creationism, the aberration that Kent Hovind represents, was not part and parcel of Christianity generally. Most Christians understood the Bible to be largely metaphorical or symbolic and wouldn't have read it as though it were literal history. It would take another 300 years for humans to get that stupid. But back to Lyell, who certainly did not claim that the Earth is billions of years old. Early estimates of Earth's age from the late 1700s into the early 19th century range from 75,000 years to 96 million. Although the latter guess is much closer to the truth than the former, it's certainly nowhere near the truth. But in those dawning days of modern science, the scientists had no way of knowing. Lord Kelvin tried his hand at it in 1862 with calculations based on cooling rates that suggested an age between 20 million and 400 million years, the amount of time he thought it would have taken a planet of Earth's mass to cool from a sphere of molten rock to its current state. But Lord Kelvin did not know about the phenomenon of radioactive decay, which wouldn't be discovered for another 3 decades, and its role in keeping the interior of the planet hot.
Well, because they needed billions of years to make their theory look good. That's why.
By the time Lord Kelvin released his calculations, Darwin had published his On the Origin of Species, and he had his doubts that a process he had described could have yielded the current diversity of species in as short a time as Lord Kelvin had proposed. He gave voice to those doubts. But no, scientists didn't try to rescue Darwin's theory by making up bigger and bigger numbers. That's the way religion works, not science. Kent ought to know this from experience. He spent most of his deplorable career trying to rescue a young Earth in a global flood from the inconvenient clutches of reality. This next excerpt was omitted from the video that my friend shared. I wonder why.
I mean, if I told you a frog could turn into a prince if you kiss it, you'd all say, well, it's a fairy tale. But if I told you, hey kids, the frog can turn to the prince if you wait billions of years. Oh, maybe so. Now it becomes believable. No, it's still a fairy tale. It's a stupid idea.
Kent's right. It's a stupid idea. It's also a straw man. No evolutionary biologist imagines a frog turning into a prince over billions of years. Kent's ploy here is to make a scientific discipline that he doesn't understand the first thing about look as ridiculous as possible so that neither he nor any of his poor deluded followers will try to understand it. But as long as we're talking about fairy tales, how about that dust man and rib woman in Genesis 2? Or those magic trees? Or that talking snake?
But the geologic column is where it all started. We covered that on video 4 and some more on video 6 about the geologic column. The Earth was divided up into layers: Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, Archeozoic. Each layer was assigned a name, an age, and an index fossil. We covered that on video 4.
There sure was a lot of passive voice construction in what I just heard. Who invented the geologic column? How'd those distinctions between geologic eras happen? Can't call them layers. Were those based on anything, or were they just made up? You know the answer to that, don't you? And no, they didn't have ages assigned to them. No one knew how old they were. They were obviously ancient, but the only kinds of ages that could be ascribed to them were relative ages. In other words, older and younger. Rocks containing theropod dinosaur fossils are older than rocks containing Eohippus fossils and younger than rocks containing trilobite fossils. Although early geologists were able to make a great deal of progress understanding the sedimentary record and were thus able to ascribe geologic epochs, periods, eras, and eons to the deposits they were studying, that's as far as they could take it until the discovery early in the 20th century that igneous rocks could be dated radiometrically, thus obtaining exact ages instead of mere relative ones. And as the science has become increasingly refined over the century since it began, those ages have been refined right along with them. All it takes to see the pattern is to compare science textbooks written in 1950 to those written in 2020, and then trace the development of those refinements in those published between those points that lie 70 years apart. In a word, Kent is either horribly misinformed or simply misspoke in an onrush of the Holy Spirit or is lying by deception. I think I know which. Check out this next bit. Prepare to be overwhelmed by Hovind's mendacity and cynicism.
Then, they said, now, we have to prove these layers are old. So they picked the numbers out of the clear blue sky, and any dating technique that comes along, like carbon dating or any other, has to match the geologic column or it's rejected. Only because the geologic column's been taught for 180 years now. So surely it's true.
I'm so glad I can't understand what it must feel like to be riding around inside that cranium looking out at the world through those eyes. Because if I did understand it, I'm afraid I might start screaming and never be able to stop. This ignorant, Bible-humping con man just slandered the whole scientific community and everything they've achieved in the last 150 years, and he grins like an evil Halloween pumpkin while he does it, and his eager followers laugh knowingly at all them pointy-headed scientists. Plural. This explains so much of the stupidity and dysfunction of my country, doesn't it?
No, just because it's been taught 180 years doesn't make it true.
Just because Christianity has defiled the earth for 2,000 years doesn't make it true.
But that's the logic the scientists will have. Well, we know the geologic column is established, therefore any carbon dates we get should match that. If they don't, we'll throw them out, and we'll keep testing till we do. They might have to test a sample 5 or 6 times till they get the number they want.
All these clowns have is projection. He just described his own motives and methods and projected them onto his opponents. I swear it's a kind of narcissism at trying to make your opponent as much like you as possible, as though you were crawling into one of their orifices and snatching their body. Ugh.
Well, how do you know any of them are right then? If you're getting a different number every time, how would you know any of them are right?
Well, since he just tossed out a generalized, unsupported scenario about several different samples from the same fossil yielding vastly different ages, and again, radiocarbon dating has nothing to do with fossils, it's impossible to address his question as framed. I have no idea whether his scenario is plausible or not. I'm sure there are cases where a specimen is subjected to examination at different depths from its surface, and one might get different radiometric dates from those different depths on account of superficial contamination. But I also know there are all kinds of ways of correcting for variables like that and homing in on the correct answer. Maybe he's talking about the reservoir effect in marine mollusks. I don't know. Since I can't address what he's insinuating here, I might as well address the self-correcting nature of science over time, since I've seen similar objections from people who don't understand that. As I just explained, over time the dates get more precise. That is, the error bars are narrowed because of greater precision in instrumentation and greater refinement of technique. Science is like that. Its results get better over time because it learns from experience, which includes learning from its mistakes. It's completely unlike religion, which starts out wrong and just stays wrong, can never acknowledge that it even makes mistakes, and takes pride in having a mind shut tighter than a gnat's anus and imagines that to be a virtue.
Radiometric dating would not have been feasible if the geologic column had not been erected first. Ever since William Smith at the beginning of the 19th century, fossils have been and still are the best and most accurate method of dating and correlating the rocks in which they occur.
That 1976 paper by J.E. O'Rourke has been a favorite quote mine of creationists ever since its publication, and every creationist who has mined it has failed to understand the article or why it was written. These out-of-context quotes are from a paper aimed at reconciling the pragmatism of early 20th century American philosophers such as Peirce, James, and Dewey with the scientific materialism commonly equated with the scientific method. They contribute nothing to Hovind's argument, such as it is. I would like to examine the language of one of them, however. Ever since William Smith at the beginning of the 19th century, fossils have been and still are the best and most accurate method of dating and correlating the rocks in which they occur. Notice that Hovind's highlighting ends with the word dating, as though this supported the claim he's in the middle of making. Now remember what I said about relative dating, the kind of dating available at the time of William Smith and ever since, the kind that can lead to accurate judgments about older and younger, and correlating, which Hovind omitted from his highlighting. Yes, what this means is that with index fossils of animals that lived in a broad geographical range but a narrow temporal one, it is possible to say that a formation exposed 100 miles away is from the same time period as the one is standing on, provided they contain the same index fossils. That was true 200 years ago and is still true today. Where's the problem?
Apart from very modern examples, which really are archaeology, I can think of no cases of radioactive decay used to date fossils.
Indeed, and that's for two reasons. One, relatively few fossils contain any carbon at all. Fossils are the lithified remains of plants and animals that were once based on carbon, but whose original material was replaced by minerals, usually quartz, calcite, or one of the sulfides or phosphates. So, of course, radiocarbon dating will have no application where such fossils are concerned. But even in those instances where fossils do contain some carbon, that is, their original material has not yet been completely replaced, any material older than about 60,000 years will have retained so little 14C that accurate measurements are impossible. Glad to have cleared that up for you.
They don't date fossils by carbon dating, they date them by their geologic position. That's how it's done.
I don't see a problem with that. Do you? Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that we cannot know the age of ancient fossils with great exactitude. But it's not by dating the fossils radiometrically, which in most instances is impossible. It is, however, possible to date igneous rocks radiometrically, and because we live on a dynamic planet, the crust is continually broken and riven with faults and fractures everywhere, and magma often wells up in those fractures and can even pool out between strata at their bedding planes. One can get very accurate radiometric dates from those, and if you have enough of them such that they surround and enclose certain strata, especially vertically, it is certainly possible to say with full confidence that a particular stratum is of such and such age, between 92 and 94 million years, say. These igneous features, sills, dikes, ancient ash falls, and so forth, can be found all over the earth and have been studied and dated, and the sedimentary rocks they enclose have also been studied and thus dated by association. Now Kent's going to try to explain the origin of 14C and will give you a great example of dumbing it down to the 4th grade level, and I'll mop up afterwards.
But here's what happens. Earth's atmosphere is about 100 miles thick. Space shuttle, in order to get free from friction, has to get up about 100 miles to be able to outside the air. And, straight up, 100 miles is not that far from here to halfway to Tallahassee, But if you go up, look at the atmosphere, it has very distinct layers to it, which is kind of interesting. It has a heat sink where it gets very, very cold, up about 7 or 8 miles up, like 80 or 90 or 100 below zero. But the Earth's atmosphere contains mostly nitrogen, 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, a little bit of CO2 for plants to breathe. Well, these don't breathe it, they're fake, but plants breathe in carbon dioxide. And there's a very tiny little bit of radioactive carbon-14, 0.0000765%. This radioactive carbon-14 is different than regular carbon. It's produced by radiation striking the sun, striking the atmosphere. Sunlight strikes the atmosphere, slaps the nitrogen around, and turns it into carbon-14.
All right, let's try to flush that comic book image of gratuitous violence out of our heads and put it in somewhat more objective language. 14C is generated high in Earth's atmosphere by the absorption of thermal neutrons by nitrogen atoms. To explain it on what really is probably the 4th grade level, the atomic number of any element is the number of protons in the nucleus of one of its atoms. and the atomic mass is the sum of the protons and neutrons in that nucleus. It's the protons that determine the essential characteristics of the element, and the number of neutrons is very often the same as the number of protons, so the atomic mass is typically the atomic number times 2. A nitrogen atom contains 7 protons and 7 neutrons, and thus has an atomic mass of 14. Carbon, on the other hand, includes 6 protons in its nucleus and usually 6 neutrons as well, yielding an atomic mass of 12. But it is possible for an atomic nucleus to include a different number of neutrons than protons, and those variants are called isotopes. Carbon is especially susceptible to this, so while 12C is by far the most common, 13C and 14C are also found wherever carbon occurs. 13C is rare but is not radioactive. 14C, which has the same atomic mass as nitrogen, is unstable and decays over time. Its production high in the atmosphere is basically as follows. High-energy radiation, cosmic rays generated by the sun and all the other myriad stars that surround us, is constantly bombarding the Earth. Those rays consist mostly of energized neutrons, and they often collide with particles in the atmosphere. When the collision is with nitrogen, which is common considering Earth's atmosphere is 78% made of the stuff, the effect is essentially that of a neutron knocking a proton out of the nucleus of a nitrogen atom, yielding an atom that is still almost precisely the same mass as before, but now exhibiting the properties of carbon, not nitrogen. As carbon, it can combine with molecular oxygen to generate carbon dioxide. And as carbon dioxide, it can be absorbed by plants and in turn taken up by the animals that eat those plants. That's a very simplified account, one that a layman like myself can understand and communicate. But as I've said before, if you really want to know how it works, you should ask a scientist, not a musician, and certainly not a creationist apologist. Anyway, I'll need to return to this point of 14C generation in next week's lesson, so hold it in mind.
So it all starts by the sunlight hitting the atmosphere. Just to give you the procedure here. About 21 pounds of carbon-14 is produced every year, and that is spread out all over the world. If I told you there's 21 pounds of gold, but it's spread out equally all over the world, forget it. I'm not even going to go look for it. Okay? You're not going to find it. Real tiny amounts.
Can't claim to know what his point is there.
If you look at a periodic table, carbon and nitrogen are right next to each other. Nitrogen has an atomic weight of 14. Carbon has an atomic weight of 12. But if the sunlight slaps the nitrogen around, it'll knock a few things off of it, and it becomes carbon-14.
Okay, that's the process I just described, but with the slapping around added to let you know he's serious. He has experience with slapping around, by the way. That's how he got to spend another 30 days of a 1-year sentence in jail, on top of his 9-year stint in a federal prison for tax evasion. I believe that's enough for this week. Next Sunday I'll take it up where I left off today, the good Lord willing and the creek don't rise. The problem one faces when trying to debunk Hovind's lies is that he can rattle off a gaggle of fabrications in far less time than it takes to debunk them. He's like Trump in that respect. As I said, it's going to take a few weeks before I can get through this, by which time I'm sure my friend will have long forgotten that I'm even doing what he challenged me to do. Meanwhile, as I've said too many times to count, consider getting your science from scientists, not from creationist apologetics, and not even from reasonably well-informed laypersons like me, and certainly not from a flat earth Facebook page. There are so many wonderful science communicators who make their work freely available on YouTube nowadays that scientific ignorance is simply indefensible. I'll provide links to a few of my favorite channels in the description below. Consider making their acquaintance if you're not familiar with them already.